Okay, if I could just encourage those leaving the public gallery to do so as quickly and as quietly as possible as we move on to the next item of business, which is a members' business debate on motion 20318 in the name of Kenneth Gibson on Holocaust Memorial Day 2026. Bridging generations. The debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons and invite Kenneth Gibson to open the debate around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's an honour to open today's debate, building on excellent contributions led in recent years by Paul O'Kane and Jackson Carlaw, making it clear that this transcends party lines. Holocaust Memorial Day is held on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on 27th of January 1945 and is often mislabelled as a remembrance of a single dark chapter in human history where the hopes, dreams and lives of 6 million Jewish men, women and children were brutally extinguished. An incalculable loss of creativity, innovation and talent in all areas of human achievement died with them. An aberrant, unparalleled crime severed from time. This year's theme, Building Generations, unsettles that illusion. When anti-Semitism, bluntly Jew hatred, is confined to isolated events, it appears exceptional and anomalous. Viewed across generations, it reveals itself as neither accidental nor episodic, but endemic. Anti-Semitism can be traced to antiquity when Jewish difference in law, custom and faith in one God was recast as misanthropy, separatism, threat. In Hellenistic and Roman societies, this difference attracted civic suspicion, embedded in the political imagination, laying the groundwork for persecution then and later. In 136 AD, the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt resulted in catastrophic Jewish losses, famine, enslavement and expulsion from what is now Israel and Palestine. Jewish communities in exile became increasingly exposed to repression, including murder and forced conversion, from 7th century Visigoth Spain to the Beta Israel in 20th century Ethiopia. In medieval Europe, anti-Semitism was increasingly articulated through theology, law and popular culture. The belief that Jews were collectively responsible for Christ's death, despite the inconvenience of the crucifixion being ordered by Judea's Roman governor Pontius Pilate, was widely enforced, legitimising exclusion and violence as religiously sanctioned acts. Jews were prohibited from land ownership, restricted to marginal employment and segregated legally and socially. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, over 150 documented blood libel accusations falsely alleged that Jews murdered Christians for ritual use. In 1965 Vatican II, this was formally repudiated and removed, the Pope removed those saints from the pantheon associated with it. The massacre of 150 Jews at York in 1190 was followed 100 years later by the expulsion of all England's Jews. Oliver Cromwell permitted their return in 1656. Scotland never had anti-Jewish laws, but few chose to settle here. In 1096, the First Crusade massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland. When Black Death struck in the 1340s, killing a third or more of Europe's population, Jews were scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells. And in 1349, authorities in Strasbourg arrested the city's entire Jewish population, and on St Valentine's Day 2000 were publicly killed. Survivors were expelled and their property confiscated. Similar pogroms occurred across Europe, including at Basel, Cologne, Erfurt and Maine. In Spain, where persecution had been periodic, 4,000 Jews were slaughtered in Seville on the 6th of June 1391, and across Iberia, mobs murdered thousands more, annihilating long-standing communities. Faced with death or forced baptism, large numbers of Jews converted to Christianity, creating a substantial population of new Christians commonly known as conversos. These were viewed with suspicion by old Christians who questioned their religious sincerity. In 1413, Geronimo de Santa Fe, a converso backed by the Church, led a 20-month one-sided theological debate, the Disputation of Tortosa, to convert Jews by discrediting their beliefs and through intimidation. He was successful and many converted. Old Christians remained suspicious of the conversos, and in 1495 and 1497 many of Santa Fe's own descendants were accused of crypto-Judaism and burnt at the stake. Expulsion of Spain's remaining Jews took place in 1492. Portugal followed 2 years later. France had already done so in 1394. They were only readmitted in 1791 after the French Revolution. Despite centuries of persecution, massacre and stigma, Jewish communities somehow endured. In Belmonte, Portugal, the Jewish community was forcibly converted in 1497. In 1974, the community of 300 re-emerged, revealing it had secretly remained Jewish, practising endogamy for 5 long centuries. Post-Enlightenment Europe became more tolerant. From Sweden to Switzerland, laws against Jews were gradually abolished, many assimilated. Yet a particularly virulent strain of Jew hatred emerged, Nazism. By the 1940s, widespread acceptance of Jews after centuries of exclusion, scapegoating and marginalisation transformed an underlying but virulent anti-Semitism into a brutal convergence of bureaucratic efficiency and moral indifference. Auschwitz-Birkenau occupies a central place in Holocaust remembrance, supported by extensive documentation and survivor testimony. Its immense death toll, approximately 1.1 million people, 90% of them Jews. Gas chambers, crematoria and barracks render its crimes both visible and symbolically representative of the horror that is the Holocaust. However, genocide took place across Nazi-occupied Europe, with Einsatzgruppen wiping out entire communities. At 5 other purpose-built extermination camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno and Majdanek, Jews were cruelly murdered and their bodies burned. Belzec underscores a critical challenge for generational remembrance, as its historical significance is obscured by the efficiency of its killing process. Operational from 17th of March 1942, by 31st of December, 434,508 Jews had been murdered, primarily in gas chambers. No one knows how many died by the time the camp closed in June 1943. With only 2 known survivors, one murdered soon after the war ended, Belzec was relegated to the margins of public memory despite its central role. Its other survivor, Rudolf Rader, born in Debice, Austria-Hungary in 1881 and deported with his wife and children to Belzec in August 1942, escaped in November, aged 61, aided by a Ukrainian woman. His children had, however, been murdered, as had his wife. Following the Soviet takeover of Poland, Rader testified in January 1946 before the Institute of National Remembrance. A major memorial at Belzec was not opened until 2004, nearly 60 years later. For many Holocaust survivors, returning home meant renewed persecution. In post-war Poland, where only 1 in 10 of its 3.3 million Jewish community survived, between 650 and 2,000 Jews were murdered, often while attempting to reclaim homes and rebuild lives. Across Eastern Europe, traumatised survivors were routinely met with discrimination and violence. And on 4th of July 1946 in Kielce, 42 Jewish survivors were slaughtered by civilians, police and soldiers following a blood libel accusation. Among the dead were women and children. 9 victims were shot, 2 bayoneted, the remainder beaten to death. Joseph Feingold, a Holocaust survivor who endured Nazi forced labour and a Soviet gulag. Released in 1946, he returned home on the very day of the pogrom to find his hometown overcome by mob violence. Feingold was beaten unconscious and left for dead. Reflecting later, he described the moment as a realisation that war against the Jews had not ended. Hatred of the Jews is an ideology that seems eternal. It can be found among religious fanatics, atheists, capitalists and communists. A hatred that accuses Jews of being too white or not white enough. A hatred rooted in a ludicrous mythical conspiracy responsible for the ills of the world. In the 1950s, across Eastern Europe, communist parties purged their Jewish members, with Stalin's campaign against rootless cosmopolitanism set to culminate in the deportation of all Soviet Jews to Siberia, had he not died in 1953. Traditionally more tolerant of Jews in the Christian world, massacres took place in many Arab countries where they had lived since before Islam. 180 were killed in Iraq in 1941, 133 in Libya, 97 in Yemen, etc. Iraq's thriving 150,000 strong Jewish community dwindled to 0. Libya has had no Jews since 1969, and Kuwait, Saudi and Afghanistan also have none. A 97% decline across the Muslim world in 80 years, the vast majority emigrating to and thereby strengthening Israel, where half the world's 16 million Jews now live. Hardly surprising when attacks on Jewish communities can seemingly happen anywhere at any time. From the murder of 11 Jewish athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics, to 85 people killed in the 1974 Buenos Aires bombing, to dozens in a series of Istanbul synagogue attacks between 1986 and 2003, to Bondi Beach, where 15 were slain only last month. Anti-Semitism is too often dismissed as marginal or incidental, framed as the actions of isolated individuals rather than symptoms of broader social currents. Australian authorities identified the Bondi Beach attack as influenced by anti-Semitic ideology. Despite this, early commentary framed the violence as anomalous rather than part of a longer continuum of hatred. Among those killed was Alex Kleitman, an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor. On its 75th anniversary, Kleitman publicly warned of rising anti-Semitic violence in contemporary society. 8 decades later, after surviving genocide, he was murdered celebrating Hanukkah. Presiding officer, sadly here in Scotland, Jews report feeling increasingly unsafe. Events in the Middle East lead to Jews here being collectively blamed for the acts of a government they did not vote for in a country they don't live in. Bridging generations begins with understanding that remembrance is not a passive act. As Hannah Arendt observed, the real risk lies in thoughtlessness, a tendency to overlook familiar patterns of hatred until they repeat themselves. Each generation inherits not only the memory of anti-Semitism, but also the responsibility to recognise its reality. Remembrance then is not just about the past, but about paying careful attention and challenging anti-Semitism today in the present. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Mr Gibson, we move to the open debate. I call first Jackson Carlo to be followed by Christine Graham in 4 minutes. Mr Carlo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In his seminal quartet biography, the accomplished psychologist and economist Ralph Glasser, Growing Up in the Gorbals, reflected that growing up he tended to hide the fact that he was Jewish in view of the prejudice prevailing in the society of his day, which burdened every step of our lives and resulted in the need to bury it beneath some protective colouring so that we might go our private ways like everybody else. Growing up as I did in the 1970s in among Scotland's largest Jewish community, I've reflected before on the fact that it was Dr. Jacob Bronowski's landmark series, The Ascent of Man, when he stood ankle-deep in the detritus of Auschwitz, not somewhere in those days that it was possible to routinely visit, and looked among the ashes at his feet at the prospect that his relatives were among them. And then, 2 years later, in 1976, Sir Jeremy Isaacs' landmark series on ITV, The World at War, which for the first time really used graphic footage of what had happened and brought to the attention of a world that perhaps had known but had not fully addressed the full consequence of the Holocaust. I thought I'd try to find answers myself. 42 years ago, I travelled along the corridor from West Germany to Berlin, thinking maybe in Berlin I would find some answer to what had happened. I stood outside Spandau prison, in which the only remaining architect of the Holocaust, Rudolf Hess, was still a prisoner. The buildings next door, all now demolished, held some of the execution chambers where Hitler hung with piano wire, not just those who stood against him, but Jews who were uncovered in Berlin in the later stages of the war. Despite the beauty still of the Tiergarten, I'm afraid there was nothing about Berlin that offered any answers at all. It was a city still devastated, the political quarter still undeveloped. Talk then of reunification seemed far-fetched, but in fact wasn't that far away. I went to Vienna, a city about which Angus Robertson has written a remarkable book, but it was very reluctant to address its support for Hitler. The Imperial Hotel, where he addressed the masses, is curiously reluctant to admit that it played any part in celebrating the Anschluss at that time or its complicity in the war that took place. I found no answers there. I thought perhaps if I travelled to Auschwitz itself, which I did 15 years ago, there would be something that would reveal what had happened. And yet, those who visited Auschwitz, as I did again just last November, this time in beautiful sunshine, only to realise that evil itself takes place under the sun, not just on dark, desolate days, which are typically those that are portrayed when one watches movies of the Holocaust. There stood really the most extraordinary apparatus of industrialised murder. Over 1 million people, not just Jews, but homosexuals, gypsies, goodness knows how many others, who were brutally exterminated in that camp. And, you know, what extraordinary it was on that beautiful day in November standing at the end of the railway track in Auschwitz where the trains came, to imagine, as I've seen in the photographs, young children after that perishingly brutal rail journey, jumping off the train, thinking they'd arrived at their destination, that, this was it, they were going to live a better life, to be marched literally 40 yards either way to the two more recently built crematoria at the top of Auschwitz to be exterminated there and then. There is no answer but that of the testimony that Kenny Gibson has just given in that very powerful speech, that anti-Semitism has been rooted in society not for decades, not for centuries, but really since Judaism was founded as a religion at all. And it falls on us. It falls on us now, as the testimony of those who were exterminated in the Holocaust becomes not the first-hand testimony, not the second-hand testimony, but historical event. It relies on us and those that follow us, those fantastic ambassadors that we have in Scotland for the Holocaust Educational Trust, all those who are determined to ensure that we confront and fight that legacy of anti-Semitism. Because across the world, as I found in Poland when I attended European Jewish Association Conference in November, which was the reason I then went to Auschwitz, it's not just here. It's across all of Europe. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, and it has to be confronted. It has to be confronted, or otherwise never again will not be never again. Never again will be now, and that will be our responsibility. We have to stop it ever happening again.
I now call Christine Graham to be followed by Paul O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I advise members that you, Deputy Presiding Officer, permitted me to leave the chamber after the speech following mine due to conflicting and long-standing obligation which has only arisen because of rescheduling this debate. I very much regret this, as I certainly would have preferred to hear all contributions. That said, what I have to say initially is not to in any way diminish the horrors of the Holocaust. Today, anti-Semitism is on the rise, and in part the conflict in Gaza gives the fuel, gives some an excuse for this. It's the elephant in the room, which I will address, I hope, sensitively. The atrocity of 7th of October, the brutality when 1,200 Jewish people were murdered, more than 5,400 injured and over 200 hostages taken, is without any defence. The following international outrage was absolutely right. But the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu and his allies in exercising revenge ostensibly on Hamas, but in Gaza with a death toll of over 69,000, including 17,000 children and at least 170,000 injured. In the West Bank, the death toll is over 1,000, including 200 children. 600,000 injured, is 6,000 injured, is an outrage with every appearance of genocide. With 90% of Gaza's population displaced and the entire surviving population facing acute lack of food, these are the deliberate actions of the Netanyahu government to prevent food and medical aid. And I would add, these statistics are not from Hamas, but from the Red Cross. DPO, I make the emphatic distinction between Netanyahu and the majority of the Israeli population who have demonstrated against his actions and who are also denied a truly free media. Netanyahu has blockaded not just their press, not just the aid convoys, but international press in Gaza. No wonder these actions have been a fertile ground for stirring hatred of the Jewish community wherever they are. For that, there is no defence. But that connection has been fostered by Netanyahu, and I quote from something he said on the 7th of October last year to the UN. Hamas carried out the worst attack on the Jews since the Holocaust. Moving on, born in 1944, I became aware of the Holocaust from my parents. Later, when reading the diary of Anne Frank, when I was about 15, the same age she was when she was eventually exposed and later executed. She hid for 2 years, from 1942 to 1944, the year I was born. She died in Belsen in 1945, one of over 6 million. But that connection with her age and mine made her more real to me, more heartbreaking. Her account of her life, her optimism on the brink of adulthood, sheltered in the attic. The reality of occupation and the courage of those who sheltered her was for her day-to-day normal. One true account among the many which converts those millions to 1 million individuals brutally murdered, lives lost. And let me say, there's not a few European nations that can escape without having blood on their hands as the death caps industrialise that murder. So we must not allow the collective memory of the Holocaust to be diminished or tarnished by the action of the Israeli government in Gaza. The Hamas atrocity does not permit atrocities in Gaza. Gaza atrocities do not permit anti-Semitism. Sadly, but it all reminds me in this month of the Bard of the continuation of man's inhumanity to man.
Thank you, Ms Graham. I now call Paul O'Kane to be followed by Maggie Chapman. Around 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is, of course, the 5th debate in this session on Holocaust Memorial Day, and it has been an honour for me in my time in this Parliament to participate in each of those alongside colleagues from across the Chamber. And Holocaust remembrance in this Parliament has been a collective endeavour across the parties, and I would pay tribute to Kenneth Gibson for leading our debate today, and I pay tribute to Jackson Carlaw for his efforts over the years along with myself, and indeed to both members for the collaboration on the commemoration events in the Parliament last week, and indeed for their collaboration over many years. I think at this point in the parliamentary session, it's important that we all rededicate ourselves to the importance of Holocaust remembrance in education, and to put, I think, on record today the importance of continuing that into the next Parliament, a Parliament which none of us know the makeup of. Of course, we can try and read the runes, but I think it's important that we all today rededicate ourselves, whether we're hoping to come back or not, to ensuring that this place continues to lead the nation in our remembrance and our calls for education. I think one of the most encouraging things in the past 5 years, which have often been difficult years in terms of the geopolitics, and some of that is being referenced today, but I think the most encouraging thing has been the voices and participation of young people that we have heard in this Parliament and across Scotland in remembering the Holocaust, educating their peers and learning for themselves, very often through encountering the places that Jackson Carlaw touched on for themselves, and broadening, I suppose, their horizons and their understanding of Holocaust and the subsequent genocide. And we can reflect on the wonderful Holocaust Educational Trust ambassadors, the Anne Frank Trust ambassadors, Vision Schools, who do such great work in our schools, Beyond Srebrenica and their work in schools through drama, and the Time for Reflection leaders we had this week. We've had a rich and diverse range of young voices in this Parliament who are passionate, eloquent, who are leading by example. And I think that really speaks to the theme for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day, which is bridging generations, because it is the duty of all of us to ensure that we are bridging the gap that now exists between living survivor testimony and subsequent generations, because there are now a generation of young people who will only encounter the Holocaust through secondary sources. They will not have the opportunity, perhaps, to meet survivors, because many of those survivors are now advanced in age and were very often children when they escaped the Holocaust. And I pay tribute to all of those survivors who continue to do everything they can to educate. I think there's something else that's really crucial this year, which I want to just touch on with my remaining time. The senior rabbi in Scotland, Rabbi Moshe Rubin, who will be known to many people in the Chamber, raised this issue on Monday night at the East Renfrewshire Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration. He raised the concerns that we have seen reported that the number of UK schools participating in events to mark Holocaust Memorial Day has fallen by 60% since the October the 7th terrorist attacks on Israel. And sitting alongside that, we know that there are surveys that show that there are many young adults, a third of young adults indeed in the UK, who are unable to name Auschwitz or any other concentration camp or ghetto where the crimes of the Holocaust were committed. When asked if young people had encountered Holocaust denial or distortion while on social media, 23% of those surveyed said yes. And 20% of survey respondents more widely in the UK believed that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed, whilst others did not know that 6 million Jewish people were killed as a result of the Holocaust. Those figures should be of concern to each and every one of us. And it should be our duty to ensure that we continue to move forward in terms of renewing a call for education and remembrance among young people. As I've said, we have wonderful examples of where that is happening in Scotland. I pay tribute to the government who continue to invest in that. I think there is a collective will across this Parliament to ensure that we do that. But I think there are really clear examples of what can happen when we do not educate, where we do not allow a space for debate and discussion, where we do not encourage young people to ensure that they are accessing sources that are reputable and true. So that is my call as we end this session of Parliament, that we take into the next Parliament, if we are fortunate enough to be here, that rededication and that re-effort to ensure that all young people and all people more generally can have high-quality Holocaust education and remembrance. I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. And I call Maggie Chapman to be followed by Beatrice Wishart in 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this members' debate on Holocaust Memorial Day, and I thank Kenny Gibson for lodging his motion. On the 27th of January, we mark the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, a date that stands as a symbol of both unimaginable horror and of survival against all odds. We remember that the 6 million Jewish men, women and children murdered by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. We remember, too, the Roma and Sinti people, the disabled people, the LGBTQIA+ people, political dissidents, and so many others who were persecuted, brutalised and killed because they were deemed unwanted, dangerous or less than human. Holocaust Memorial Day is not only about remembrance, it is about responsibility. The theme, as we've heard, for 2026, Bridging Generations, speaks powerfully to that duty. As survivors age and fewer remain to tell their stories in person, the responsibility to remember does not fade, it deepens. Memory must live on through children, grandchildren, communities and institutions, and through our actions as lawmakers. I've spoken before in this chamber about the importance of listening to testimony, to survivors, to refugees, to those whose lives have been marked by violence and displacement. Testimony is not passive. When we truly listen, we are changed and we are called to act. Bridging generations means ensuring that remembrance does not become ritual without meaning, but a living commitment to justice, peace and dignity. We cannot honestly remember the Holocaust without acknowledging what followed. The promise of never again was made in the ashes of Europe. Yet, in the 81 years since the end of the Second World War, genocide and mass atrocities have scarred our world again and again. In Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, against the Yazidi people, and today for all of us to see in Palestine. To say this is not to diminish the Holocaust, it is to honour its lessons. The dehumanisation that enabled the Holocaust did not vanish in 1945. It reappears whenever whole peoples are reduced to threats, statistics, or collateral damage. When civilians are starved, burned, bombed, displaced, and denied basic humanity, we must have the courage to name what is happening and to insist on accountability, protection of human life, and an end to violence. Holocaust Memorial Day calls us to a zero-tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, and that commitment is absolute. Anti-Semitism is real, it is rising, and it must be confronted wherever it appears. But that commitment sits alongside, not in opposition to, our responsibility to challenge all forms of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Roma prejudice, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all dehumanisation and bigotry. Justice is not selective. Human rights are not conditional. As Greens and as parliamentarians committed to peacemaking, we believe that security does not come from domination or erasure, but from justice, equality and respect for international law. Remembering the Holocaust demands that we reject the idea that some lives matter less than others. whether because of religion, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality or disability. Bridging generations also means speaking honestly to young people. They see the world as it is, fractured, violent and unequal. But they also bring clarity and moral courage. They ask why lessons we claim to have learned are still being ignored. We owe them more than platitudes. We owe them action. Presiding Officer, Holocaust Memorial Day is a moment of solemn remembrance, but it is also a call to conscience. To remember is to resist. To remember is to stand against hatred in all its forms. And to remember is to act for peace, for justice, and for a future where never again is not a slogan, but a reality for all. And I'll close with the words from Holocaust survivor Eliza Wiesel in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented.
Thank you. And I call Beatrice Wishart to be followed by Karen Adam. Around 4 minutes, Ms Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And thank you to Kenny Gibson for bringing this important debate to the Chamber today. I'm not sure I can follow. There's been so many great speeches. I'm not sure my contribution is as good as anybody else's. But I shall try. So can I also thank... sorry, I'm going to have to sit for a minute.
Paul O'Kane.
I'm very grateful to Beatrice Wishart for taking the intervention. I'm sure her speech will be, and this is obviously a very difficult subject to discuss, but does she agree with me that the importance of young people in this debate and in Holocaust commemoration is really important? And I'm sure she will have seen in Shetland and her own community those young people speaking up and standing up and ensuring that they are making that contribution to ensuring that we all continue with Holocaust remembrance.
I thank Paul O'Kane for that and for giving me a minute to breathe. So can I also thank the 2 young Holocaust Educational Trust ambassadors for their powerful contributions earlier this week in the Chamber at Time for Reflection. This year's theme of Holocaust Memorial Day is Bridging Generations. As the number of living camp survivors dwindle, we seek to continue to pass on their testimony, the lived experience of the horrors of the Holocaust, to young people so future generations learn in the hope that history does not repeat itself. It is our duty to ensure that the brutal and barbaric murder of 6 million Jewish men and women and children in the Nazi regime and its collaborators during the Second World War is not forgotten. There is no place for anti-Semitism, but as others have said, it's on the rise and it must be called out. We hear the voices from the Jewish community in the UK today, fearing for their and their children's safety. And we must root out and challenge Holocaust denial and revisionism wherever we find it. Today we rightly focus on the victims of the Holocaust, and we also remember others who perished at the hands of the Nazi regime. Presiding Officer, I learned about the Holocaust when I was quite young, like Christine Graham. Both my parents signed up to serve King and Country in the Second World War. My father was an army film cameraman out in Burma, and my mother was in the Women's Royal Navy Service, the Wrens, stationed in London for part of the war when bombs were being dropped on the city. News in those days came via the radio, newspapers or newsreels in the cinema. Near the end of the war, news seeped out about death camps and gas chambers in Europe. And I remember my mother recalling her shock of seeing the haunting images that we are all now familiar with in those newsreels of the liberation of camps with names that have gone down in history: Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Birkenau. She could not comprehend that people could inflict such horror, brutality and degradation on other human beings. That was over 80 years ago, and we would be wrong to think that genocide is consigned to the history books. Sadly, we have seen it in too many other places in the intervening years. And like Christine Graham, I read Anne Frank's diary in my teens. Shetland has its own unique place in the history books. During the Second World War, a fleet of small fishing boats crossed the North Sea between Norway and Shetland under cover of winter darkness, and it became known as taking the Shetland bus bringing to safety those who were fleeing persecution and whose lives were at risk in Nazi-occupied Norway. The fishing boats returned to Norway with the supplies for the clandestine operations of the brave Norwegian resistance, and around 350 refugees came to the UK via the Shetland bus route, including some Jewish people, and each person a life saved. Presiding Officer, when we pass the important history of the Holocaust down the generations, we should instil the timeless democratic ideals of pluralism, difference, diversity. And it's crucial that we hold on to openness, human rights and cooperation in global affairs and in our domestic politics. Words matter, as does action. We look around the world today and we see prejudice and persecution and people being targeted like those at Australia's Bondi Beach last month. Nowhere is immune. In bridging generations, we must stamp out prejudice in all its forms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Fisher. And I call Karen Adam to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I must firstly thank Kenneth Gibson for bringing this motion to the Chamber today and pay tribute to the wonderful contributions from across the Chamber, and particularly pay tribute to the exceptionally moving contribution from Beatrice Wishart. These debates matter, Presiding Officer, because it gives us the space not just to reflect on history and on the past, and to think of all those who were lost, but also to consider what that history asks of us here, now, today. Marked on the 27th of January, Holocaust Memorial Day, it falls on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a place that has come to symbolise the sheer scale of the brutality of the Holocaust. 6 million Jewish men, women and children murdered by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. But alongside them, also people, not necessarily Jewish, but with other characteristics: Roma people, disabled people, deaf people, LGBT people, political opponents, and others who were deemed unworthy of life. And that was not an accident of history. It was the result of ideology, of dehumanisation, and of systems being turned against people. I recently attended the Holocaust Memorial Day event in the Scottish Parliament, and I really want to reflect on that experience because it has stuck with me. As these events often do, we heard directly from a Holocaust survivor, and she spoke about her childhood during the war, about the fear that was constant, about hiding, and about the calculations that her and her family had to make again and again, simply just to stay alive. And these were not abstract decisions, they were human ones made under unimaginable pressure, where a single mistake could cost them everything. She spoke about living in France in occupied territory and explained that it was not just Nazi SS soldiers that her family were hiding from, but also the Vichy police, ordinary police officers wearing uniforms representing the institutions that people were meant to trust. Now, she didn't draw these parallels to the present day, and I'm not claiming to do that on her behalf, but it was a reminder to me of something deeply important, that threats don't always look like what you would expect. Sometimes it looks official, sometimes it looks legitimate, and sometimes it presents itself as order. She went on to describe how Jewish people were stripped of their humanity gradually through language, through labelling, and through being spoken about as lesser, as a problem, and as something to be managed. Sitting, listening, it was impossible not to reflect on the power of language and how easily harm can be justified once people are never seen as fully human. The theme for Holocaust Memorial Day this year is Bridging Generations, and it was great to see a pupil at that event from my constituency, from Banff Academy, Finlay Cleland, who was reciting a poem that he had written after visiting Bosnia, where another horrific genocide was committed. Presiding Officer, it gives me hope to see young people take note, seeing our efforts to pass down this history being picked up and guarded is exactly what we must aim for, because without that, remembrance risks becoming something that we mark rather than something that actually changes us. In closing, Presiding Officer, I just want to say that it's not just about remembering the dead, but it's also about protecting the living. And I hope we listen, we learn, and we carry these lessons forward, not just in words, but in deeds, and in the choices that we make to protect our human rights and our values and have humanity every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Allen. We come to the final speaker in the open debate, Stephen Kerr. Around 4 minutes, Mr Kerr.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I think Karen Adam is right. I think there have been some excellent, in fact all the speeches in this debate have been excellent, and I wish to thank Kenny Gibson and Jackson Carlaw and Paul O'Kane for the work they have done in keeping the spirit of remembrance in connection with Holocaust Memorial Day in this Parliament. I would also like to pay tribute to Beatrice Wishart, who gave a very moving speech, and she brought to my memory the broadcast, the very famous broadcast of Richard Dimbleby reporting from Belsen. Members will be aware that when he filed his report, the management at the BBC were reluctant to broadcast it, and it was only because Richard Dimbleby threatened to resign if it wasn't broadcast that it was broadcast at all. And that, I'm afraid, is also an apocryphal story about the nature of man's inhumanity to man, and perhaps our determination at times to hide away from brutal realities. Holocaust Memorial Day was created not simply to remember the past, but to guard the future. And the 2026 theme, Bridging Generations, as has been said by many members, could not be more necessary than it is now, because we are living through a period in which the facts of the Holocaust are not just fading with time and with the passing of generations, but are being openly challenged, distorted, mocked and weaponised. And that should alarm every one of us. We said, collectively, as a human race, after the horrors of the 1930s and 40s, that what happened to Europe's Jews would never happen again. Maggie Chapman rightly has identified a whole list of occasions since 1945 when, I'm afraid, that lesson and that vow has not been remembered and has not been kept. We said that the systematic attempt to eradicate an entire people, men, women and children, would stand forever as a warning to humanity, and yet today we see anti-Semitism re-emerging with a confidence that would have been unthinkable even a decade ago. Not whispered, not hidden, but shouted, shared online, excused as politics, and too often indulged by institutions that should be holding the line, including schools and public bodies who quietly step back from Holocaust education or commemoration because it's seen as too difficult or too controversial. Since October the 7th, something deeply troubling has happened. The events in the Middle East have been used as a licence by some to reopen the sewer of anti-Jewish hatred. Hatred that is racial in nature, whatever language it dresses itself up in, hatred that holds Jewish people collectively responsible, denies their right to safety, treats their fear as something to be dismissed. And the consequences are not theoretical. Jewish people in this country, people who've lived here for generations, now speak openly about feeling unsafe, about hiding the symbols of their faith, about considering whether this country is still a place where their children can grow up without fear. And that should shame us. We saw last year in Manchester how quickly that hatred turns into violence. And, as has been referenced, we've seen similar events around the world, including Bondi Beach. These are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of something darker, a culture in which historical truth is weakened and moral boundaries are blurred. And that is why Holocaust education has never been more important, not as a ritual, not as a box to tick, but as a defence against lies. The Holocaust is now being challenged in ways that are new, in a scale and a confidence that is incredible. Young people are exposed to denial, trivialization, outright conspiracy online. The language of genocide is distorted, the facts are blurred, the intent is clear: to erode memory, to distort. And with all of that, any sense of collective responsibility. I do not accept that this pathway that we're on is an inevitability. Freedom of expression matters, but it must never become a cover for propaganda or fake history. There's a difference between debate and denial, between criticism and dehumanisation. A society that forgets that difference does not stay free for long. So today, we remember the victims, we honour the survivors, but above all, we recommit ourselves to the future, to education, to vigilance, to the courage to confront hatred wherever it appears, because memory alone is not enough. What we do with it now will decide whether future generations inherit truth or something far more dangerous.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now invite Siobhan Brown to respond to the debate. Minister, around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Firstly, can I just thank Kenny Gibson for tabling today's motion, which provides us with an invaluable opportunity to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day. It's always really deeply moving, this debate, to hear all the really heartfelt reflections offered by members, but it's also equally uplifting that during such a vital period of remembrance we can all stand shoulder to shoulder. There were so many excellent speeches, every single one of them. I'm just going to name a few. Kenny Gibson, a very powerful speech. Kenny Gibson, I sometimes think you're a walking encyclopedia.
Minister, if you could address the microphone, please.
The walking encyclopedia gave a very in-depth historical overview outlining how deep-rooted Jewish hatred can be and how it must be challenged. Jackson Carlaw, his very personal journey over many years trying to understand why, and there is no answer, and anti-Semitism is on the rise, and how we have to all have a responsibility to challenge it and to confront it at every opportunity, which was echoed by Maggie Chapman and also Beatrice Wishart. Paula Kane and Stephen Kerr raised the importance of education. As Paula Kane said, our Parliament must move forward to lead the nation in remembering and also educating and bridging the gap, and living testimony must continue through education. Beatrice Wishart, thank you so much for your very emotive contribution. Genocide is not consigned to the history books, and it's really important, the importance of bridging the generations. Presiding Officer, today we honour the 6 million Jewish men and women and children murdered, as well as the millions more who were targeted, persecuted and killed by the Nazis. We also pay our respects to the countless number of innocent people whose lives were callously cut short in the genocides which followed in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur. Holocaust Memorial Day marks the liberation of Auschwitz, a place where unspeakable cruelty and an inescapable reminder of the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime. It is vital to understand that this crime against humanity was not sudden in nature, nor was it inevitable. It was instead the result of creeping yet purposeful dehumanisation of the Jewish people, whose very basic human rights were eroded in a climate of the most extreme hatred. When I had the privilege of visiting Srebrenica last year with fellow member Paula Kane as part of a delegation to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Bosnian genocide, I was overwhelmed by the care given to building a lasting legacy to the 8,000 Muslim men and boys that were massacred by Bosnian Serb soldiers. This was the largest incident of mass murder in Europe since the Second World War, but much like the Holocaust, the roots of it can be tracked back to the intensifying levels of prejudice which sowed the seeds of genocidal acts that would later follow. And such deplorable events have left lasting scars on our world, a stark warning of the terrible consequences if we stand idle in the face of bigotry and discrimination. Committing to confronting and learning from the horrors of the past must never serve only as words, but a moral obligation and a call to action that unites each and every one of us. The recent horrific attacks that occurred both in Manchester and of my home city in Sydney, Bondi Beach, show us that there was a zero-tolerance approach to anti-Semitism. This is why the Scottish Government is taking decisive measures to ensure all of our diverse communities are robustly protected against those who seek to cause harm. Our hate crime strategy aims not to just ensure victims of prejudicial criminality are cared for and supported, but to strategically address the roots of this behaviour through engaging constructively with partners in the justice system. Schools play a vital role in supporting children and young people to challenge prejudices like anti-Semitism and help our young people to value a diverse and a respectful Scotland. Through educating our young people about all cultures, all faiths and belief systems, we support them to become responsible and truly global citizens, whilst helping to counteract prejudice and exclusion at the earliest opportunity. We see Holocaust education as a vital component of this. This is why we continue to be committed to providing opportunities for Scotland's children and young people to learn about the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism within our curriculum. And this includes providing grant funding of up to £200,000 in this financial year to the Holocaust Educational Trust Lessons from Auschwitz programme, which gives students and teachers an opportunity to visit Auschwitz. We also fund £40,500 to Vision Schools Scotland, who encourage effective school-based Holocaust education by supporting teachers in their teaching of the Holocaust and in addressing anti-Semitism. Before I close, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the Scottish ceremony which was kindly hosted at the Parliament last Thursday night by our friends of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. And I know that Karen Adams did refer to this in her contribution as well. It was an honour to share the platform with two remarkable individuals, Joan Salter, a survivor of the Holocaust, and Var Ash Houston, who was a survivor of the Cambodian genocide. They shared with us very personal and at times emotional and heartbreaking, yet really inspiring stories of survival in the face of some of the worst adversities one could ever possibly imagine. Also in attendance and providing a range of poignant reflections were a number of young people, including ambassadors from the Anne Frank Trust and the Holocaust Educational Trust, which Jackson Carlaw did refer to in his contribution as well. Their compassionate and considered contributions brought to light why the message of this year's theme, Bridging Generations, is so vital in these precarious times, and that by carrying forward the voices of the past, we can work collectively towards a better future. Presiding Officer, as time moves on, we are now more than ever duty-bound to preserve their memories. This responsibility takes an even greater resonance as we seek to guard against growing distortion and those whose motivation is to undermine the truth and the horrors human beings can inflict on one another. By remaining unified, our resolve to resist exclusionary and dehumanising narratives and instead championing the inclusive values that underpin our society, we together, we can have a Scotland where each of us may flourish both in safety and in peace. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate. I suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:15.